Hey everyone, this is Brown at IF Brown, and tonight we're going to be talking about Essential Ghostwriter, Volume 2. So, this particular volume collects issues 21 through 50 of the original Ghostwriter series that focused on Johnny Blaze. And I have to say that, in comparison to having read Volume 1 of the Essential Ghostwriter, this particular volume was much more rewarding, both in terms of collected material as well as the competence of the creative teams involved. And the first volume, I think, suffered from the fact that you had multiple creative teams involved that never really knew what to make of what they're trying to do with their main character, and as a result, a lot of the stories tended to be very schizophrenic in terms of tone, and also the main drawback to the majority of the stories that were collected in the first volume was that almost all the villains were in some way tied to Satan, and that just made it to where there was a lack of originality to the majority of the rogues gallery that turned up in Volume 1. And also it contributed to the feeling of repetitiveness and boredom that, frankly, I had at times when actually reading the stories involved. To be fair, though, the artwork, at the very least, made the stories look good. So even though the stories honestly were not good, at least in my opinion, they were at least fun and cool to look at. Volume 2, however, I think goes a great way towards rectifying the problem that Volume 1 had, in the sense that while Johnny Blaze, having made a deal with the devil, is still a part of his character and as well as his backstory, the creative teams went out of their way to show that there were more villains in the world that were not tied to Satan and that were, in fact, their own agents with their own agendas. And as a result, the rogues gallery that is on hand here is far more fascinating, and the conflicts are much more rewarding. And also, the creative teams do a good job of actually making Johnny Blaze into a functional, three-dimensional character that has quite a bit of substance. And starting with issue 21, Gerry Conway, an old school Marvel writer who, amongst other things, co-created the character of the Punisher, is the writer who comes up with issues 21 through 23. And at that point in the Ghost Rider comics, there was still that feeling of, I guess you could say, random rogues galleries, or a random rogues gallery that tended to carry over from Volume 1. But that being said, Gerry Conway, I think, did a pretty good job on trying to steer away from the sort of, I guess you could say, schizophrenic tone of the series, and make it, I guess you could say, more mainlined and level-headed. And so once he leaves the series, writer Jim Shooter takes over for a couple issues, namely 24 through 27. And in my last review of Volume 1, one of the things I pointed out about Jim Shooter was that he essentially pulled a dick move on one of the writers of the series, the writer Tony Isabella, in the sense that Tony Isabella's final issue that he wrote for the series was in fact not written by him, even though he's credited in the credits, I guess you could say. And in fact, Jim Shooter essentially chunked the original script out and Ghost wrote the rest of it himself. And so Tony Isabella got credit for that story, even though it wasn't his actual script. Like, the artwork was left intact, but his final work on the series wasn't even his own. It was just his name, and Jim Shooter came in and basically just redid everything. And so it was one of those moves that I understand why Jim Shooter did it, and why I guess one of the editorial bigwigs okayed it, because originally what was going to happen was Tony Isabella was going to turn Johnny Blaze into a born-again Christian, wherein he would still have the Ghost Rider's abilities that were given to him by Satan, but nonetheless he would be fighting against the curse, and if he were to use his powers, he would use them only for good. And so Jim Shooter and another editorial bigwig were basically like, no, that's not going to work for an ongoing series, especially with the guy's backstory. And so also another reason that Jim Shooter ixnayed the born-again Christian storyline was because he didn't want to alienate readers who were not Christian. And so while heaven and hell, God and the devil have been depicted in the Marvel Universe in one way or another, Jim Shooter wasn't wanting to say, he wasn't wanting to explicitly say that the Marvel Universe operated strictly on a Judeo-Christian scale of spirituality and morality. And so basically, when he came in, he took over the original script, or he redid the original script to where basically any sort of build-up to Johnny Blaze being a born-again Christian was basically thrown out the door, and certain plot developments that hinted at some form of redemption for Johnny Blaze were basically just another trick of the devil. And so anyway, the reason I say that is because while I still think that was a dick move on Jim Shooter's part, I do think that it was a better way to keep the series going, because I really think that the series would have ended rather swiftly if Tony Isabella's direction had been given the go-ahead. But because that wasn't the case, the series was able to go on for far longer than it would have otherwise. And so even though I think that that was still a dick move on Jim Shooter's part, it was probably the right call. I just wish that behind the scenes, maybe he and Tony Isabella had had a sit down, and Jim Shooter explained the situation and said, look, we'll give you the go ahead to write the last issue, but you have to change it in a way to where that's not going to happen, but we're going to let you end your run on the series with your own words. I wish it had been something like that, but that wasn't the case. That being said, though, when Jim Shooter comes in on issue 24 and writes the series until issue 27, he actually does a pretty good job as far as writing goes. And in fact, he's actually the first writer to really start to establish the fact that the Ghost Rider is more than just an act on Johnny Blaze's part, because up until this point, Johnny Blaze had been established as someone who turned into the Ghost Rider, but still maintained his persona. His own personality as Johnny Blaze, just in Ghost Rider's body. But that being said, Jim Shooter was the one who actually began to play with the notion that Johnny Blaze literally was turning into someone else. And so there would be little cues wherein the moments when Johnny Blaze as Ghost Rider would play up the demonic persona to scare criminals. At first it's all just theatrics, but somewhere along the way, whenever Johnny Blaze starts speaking as Ghost Rider, as a demonic entity, he starts noticing that the demonic speeches, the dark evil speeches that he makes in order to cow the criminals into submission, it comes a lot more easily to him all of a sudden. Whereas before, it was like he was acting off the bottom of his cuff, so to speak, or it was off the cuff, so to speak, and it was off the top of his head, and he was just playing up every sort of horror story or horror movie cliche you could think of in terms of big bad demonic monsters. But somewhere along the way, he actually starts to become Ghost Rider, and so there will be moments where after having acted more demonic, he realizes that somewhere he stopped playing up the Ghost Rider persona and has actually started to become the Ghost Rider personality. And so I have to say, I really have to give credit for Jim Shooter, for introducing this development into the series, because it was definitely something that made the series a lot more interesting and to read. And you also started to get some nuance to the character of Johnny Blaze, because when Gerry Conway was writing the series for the brief amount of time he wrote, which was issues 21 to 23, I felt like he was still operating in the shadow of the comics that came beforehand, whereas Jim Shooter is the one who actually started to take things into a new direction, and the book really started to take on a life of its own. And when he was writing it, to be fair, the villains that he worked with, or they introduced into the series, were the characters of the Enforcer as well as the Water Wizard. And Water Wizard has been regarded as kind of a semi-classic Ghost Rider foe, but unfortunately, the Water Wizard, just kind of looks ridiculous in terms of his costume. And the way he uses his powers is actually pretty cool, but it's just that the character himself, was written in sort of a, manner and to where you got the idea that it was someone who was randomly given these fantastical abilities, but he really had no sense of how to properly use them in terms of committing crime and what have you, or at the very least, while he might have been successful in other circumstances, the fact that the first time out as this new villainous persona, he tries to take on Ghost Rider, and Ghost Rider basically just wipes the floor with him, after getting over some initial confusion to, the Water Wizard's abilities. And so I did like that aspect of the Water Wizard's character, even though I just didn't think the character himself was that good. But I just like the notion that the Water Wizard might have actually been more effective if he was going up against strictly ordinary opponents, like, say, police officers or something like that. Whereas because he's going up against Ghost Rider, who is actually starting to tap into the more demonic side of things in terms of his abilities, and the fact that the underworld at this point in time thought that the Ghost Rider was just Johnny Blaze with a fancy motorcycle helmet that had some special effects involved. He's still operating by the underworld's quote-unquote knowledge of Ghost Rider, but he finds out the hard way that Ghost Rider is more than special effects. It's a legitimately demonic entity. And so as to the Enforcer, he felt like more of a holdover from the stories that were in, say, some of the issues of Volume 1, in the sense that like there are hints of a criminal conspiracy, and there was a moment or two where I was thinking that the Enforcer was going to be quote unquote an agent of Satan again, but thankfully that was averted. It was just he had a very sort of old school depiction in terms of, I guess, how villains were written at the time. Sort of like maybe the Crime Master from the Amazing Spider-Man comics. I think that's what the guy was called. But whereas the Enforcer, though, I'm not going to say like he was a good villain, but he felt like, say, someone who was the type of villain that was common at the time that the Ghost Rider comics were written. And so, you could have thrown him into, say, a Fantastic Four comic or a Captain America comic, and he would have still been the same. Just because he's in a Ghost Rider comic, he kind of stands out in the sense that he's, other than, say, like the villain, the Orb, he's one of the few non-supernatural characters that Ghost Rider goes up against at this point in his career. And so I did appreciate that aspect of his character, that he actually wasn't supernatural. Anyway, though, so I thought it was interesting how Jim Shooter basically it was writing in a way that felt typical to the time that comic books were written, and using villains that you could have easily put into another comic, to where they didn't necessarily feel wholly original, but at the same time there were aspects of them that kind of stood out, made them stand out in some ways, even if I didn't think they were good villains. But I think the main thing he did for the series was he was arguably the first writer to actually start to drop hints that Johnny Blaze was literally turning into the Ghost Rider, in more than just physical transformation, but in terms of his mind as well. But for me, at least, the series really begins to take off to a point of, say, the stories being good through and through, when the writer Roger McKenzie took over for the series, and he wrote issues, 28 through 34. And I honestly wish that he had worked on the series for longer than he did, because even though it was only for a couple of issues, he, I think, did an excellent job of not only making Johnny Blaze a more relatable character, but he also did a good job of bringing in some memorable villains. And even if, say, most of these villains were never seen outside of the stories that they were introduced in, whether they would be one-part or two-part stories, they were very memorable villains. And I think that they kind of they were a good mixture of, say, supernatural villains, as well as, say, more non-supernatural villains. And I think that Roger McKenzie did a good job of building on Jim Shooter's approach to things, in terms of also beginning to establish that the Ghost Rider was its own demonic entity. Like it was totally separate from Johnny Blaze, and it wasn't. I mean, this was no longer Johnny Blaze, turning into someone that happened to have demonic powers, but still have Johnny Blaze's personality. But you actually begin to see, the dark side, and how he really begins to cut loose when he's turned into Ghost Rider. Like, even when he's somewhat in control in terms of the thoughts, he can't really he has a harder time controlling himself whenever he's in, say, Ghost Rider form. Like, he really has to struggle a lot harder to basically have some sort of hold on Ghost Rider's actions, and he realizes that something's wrong here. And to be fair, prior to Roger McKenzie taking over, the last issue that Jim Shooter did for the series, he had let me phrase that. It was the next to last issue that Jim Shooter did for the series. He had Ghost Rider confront the character of Dr. Druid, who is similar to Doctor Strange, but his magic is basically it's more like, whereas Doctor Strange is a sorcerer supreme with access to all sorts of magic, Dr. Druid specifically focuses on magic that's based on, say, Druid ancestry, and so that in itself has a lot of lore attached to it. So I thought that was rather interesting, because they made a point to show that while, yes, Dr. Druid and Doctor Strange are very similar characters, both characters are very different in terms of how they use their magical abilities and what have you. And speaking of Doctor Strange, Roger McKenzie actually brings Doctor Strange into the Ghost Rider comic. Namely, he has classic Doctor Strange foe Dormammu trick Ghost Rider into thinking that Doctor Strange is in league with the forces of hell, and he makes him see horrific things like Roxanne Simpson about to be burned as a witch, and Doctor Strange is orchestrating the whole thing, and other things like that. And so and the whole thing is he's wanting to use Ghost Rider as an unknowing pawn in taking Doctor Strange out. So not only will he be able to reassert himself as the dominant force in his realm, but also to attack the mortal world directly. And so Doctor Strange and Ghost Rider, they have their fight, and and kind of building on Jim Shooter's story with Dr. Druid going up against Ghost Rider, Doctor Strange comes to realize that one, Johnny Blaze is basically a pawn of a demonic force and isn't wholly responsible for his actions as Ghost Rider. And also he's realizing that, much like Dr. Druid did, that Ghost Rider is a whole demonic force that's separate from Johnny Blaze entirely. And so he also realizes that Johnny Blaze is actually a good person, but trapped in a horrific situation. And he's in a position to where he and his friends are having to clean up after Dormammu, but Johnny Blaze has his own problems, and Doctor Strange is in a spot to where he can't just step out and help Johnny Blaze. Like, he has to contend with the aftermath of Dormammu's attack against him. But he feels that he can trust Johnny Blaze to come out on top in his situation. And so, speaking of which, another memorable storyline is when Roger McKenzie brings in the character of the Bounty Hunter, who in an odd way is almost like a precursor to the Ghost Rider, in the sense that he's a character who was basically trapped in a sort of deal with the devil type of situation. And in the Bounty Hunter's case, he has to he was a guy from way back in the Western days, and he was a bounty hunter named Haschel, and he was not a nice guy, and he was known for shooting people in the back and then taking their corpses to whoever he collected the bounty from. He wasn't a stand and fight kind of guy, but he's basically cursed to hell by a dying victim of his, and so he finds himself in this situation where a demonic entity, possibly the devil, or maybe just another demon from hell who has his own empire or something like that, makes a deal with him, and he says that if you bring 50 souls of my choosing to my domain, then you'll be free from this curse. And so the bounty hunter, he's gone throughout time in hunting down these victims. And his last victim, as it turns out, is Johnny Blaze. And so, and Johnny Blaze actually finds himself in a situation where he feels some sort of empathy for the bounty hunter, because he realizes that the two of them in some ways are very similar. I mean, they may be very different in terms of personalities, but they're both in very similar situations. And he's trying to convince the bounty hunter that, yes, you may be stuck with, you may have made a deal with the devil, and you may be stuck with these nightmarish abilities, but if you're still you, if you still have some measure of control, you can fight this. And I like the fact that Johnny Blaze was trying to reach out to this guy, because even though the bounty hunter is not a good person, whether in life or his sort of undeath, you do feel a certain measure of sympathy for him, just to some degree, in the sense that he's trying to avoid complete damnation to hell. Like, in a way, he's partially damned already, but at the same time, he believes that if he completes the devil's objective, or at least this demonic entity's objective, then at the very least he'll be, say, in purgatory as opposed to straight up hell. But Johnny Blaze is trying to tell him that, hey, anytime you make a deal with the devil, whether it be the actual devil or a demon, you're going to get screwed over. And so Haschel, or the bounty hunter, actually does start to realize that Johnny Blaze is right, and the two of them do try to fight back against the demonic emissaries that are sent after the bounty hunter, because he hasn't killed Johnny Blaze at a certain time as of yet. Because the thing is, he's supposed to kill Johnny Blaze, and then supposedly his soul will be free at a certain time. But because he hasn't done that yet, these demonic emissaries are sent after the bounty hunter. And so Johnny Blaze does try to help Haschel fight these guys, but unfortunately, it's more like one of those situations where, because it's not his story, he doesn't have control over it. At this point, it's the bounty hunter's story, and the bounty hunter's damned to his fate. And it's a very unsettling, moment for Johnny Blaze, because he realizes that, he was able to, in some ways, he feels like in some ways he was able to escape his curse in some ways. Like, he's still stuck. He still turns into Ghost Rider, and the Ghost Rider persona is taking on a more evil tone, but at the same time he still has some measure of control, and he's able to fight back. But he also realizes that at any point in time things could turn around, and seeing Haschel being taken off to hell like that, it's something that really shook him up. So I thought that the bounty hunter storyline was a really good one, because yes, it does involve a character who made a deal with the devil, but I feel like in the way they did it here, they the creative team did a really good job of establishing that while yes, this is still going to be a part of Johnny Blaze's storyline, there are multiple people who have, say, made deals with the devil, and hell is different for everyone. And so I thought that was, I really liked that they actually differentiated between, say, the character of the bounty hunter as well as Blaze. Like, they're both cursed, but in different ways. And so it wasn't just, say, another scheme of the, it wasn't just another scheme wherein, the bounty hunter, was Satan the whole time or something like that. And also I liked how, right after that, the last issues that Roger McKenzie wrote were more, say, science fiction in nature. And science fiction and Ghost Rider are, two concepts that you don't think would go well together. And for the most part, you'd probably be right. But I really think that Roger McKenzie, in his last two issues on the series, actually managed to combine the two together and turn out a rather memorable two-part story to end his run. And in the storyline that he wrote, in this final two-parter, Ghost Rider, he finds himself in this, or sorry, Johnny Blaze finds himself in this ghost town, and he finds it that other than himself, there's only one other person there. This really old guy named Woody, who claims that he used to be a prospector a long time ago, and Johnny Blaze is like, how the hell are you still alive then? And because the guy, I mean, he's old, but he's spry on his feet and what have you. But also, he shows him this stash of gold that he has, like multiple bags of gold, and it turns out that he has this seemingly magical ability, to find gold, wherever it's buried, or to turn gold into, say, a more I guess you could say, coin-based form. And so he and Johnny Blaze, I mean, at first they sort of butt heads, but then it turns out that there's a bigger force at work, because Woody had initially thought that Johnny Blaze was someone who was sent by the person he's on the run from, but it turns out that Johnny Blaze obviously wasn't. It was this person makes themselves known, and by way of this massive futuristic looking spaceship, and these robotic motorcycle riders attack them, the two of them. And Johnny Blaze finds out to his horror that these robots actually have living organic brains. And so Woody, when he sees this, he's telling Johnny Blaze that that the person that's coming after them wants to turn him and Johnny Blaze into just more of these automatons. And but unfortunately, Johnny Blaze and Woody are overwhelmed, and once Johnny Blaze comes to, he finds himself face to face with the person involved, pulling the strings in all this, and it's actually a kid, a child named Nathan, who is in this sort of transparent sphere, just sort of floating in place. But it turns out that Nathan is, in fact, a mutant who's been around since, he's been around for a long time. We're talking a couple of hundreds of years. And it turns out that when he was born, people thought that he was the spawn of a witch because he had glowing eyes and what have you. And so these village witch hunters came to their home, and they incapacitated his father, and they murdered his mother. And they're about to do the same to him, but then his powers activated, and he turned them all into these shambling monstrosities and left them like that. And so, his father... he sees all this and is kind of made into his slave through sheer mental will on Nathan's part, and he also reanimates the dead body of his mother too. And so for centuries, Nathan will be towed around by his father and the corpse of his mother, and he has this fantastic knowledge on how to build things. But unfortunately, one of the drawbacks of his mutation is that he's physically frail, and so he's forced to live in this sort of mechanized bubble that he forces his father to help with creating. And over time, he was able to basically create his own world, which is this sort of saucer-like ship that came after Johnny Blaze and Woody. And what he's wanting to do is, have his own slave race, and live separately from the world around him. But Woody, though, where he gets involved was because back when he was prospecting, he accidentally stumbled upon a part of the ship that was buried in the ground, and once he stepped into the ship, he accidentally accessed some of the machinery, and he was changed to the point where he had an extended lifespan, but he was also given the ability to find resources, and that's how he found all these bags of gold, and he was able to turn the natural gold into, say, a more coin-based version of it. But then Nathan would send some of his forces after Woody, and Woody, he had been on the run from Nathan for quite some time. It wasn't until Johnny Blaze stumbled upon the ghost town that Woody was staying in. It wasn't until then that Nathan was able to find Woody, and he wants to reclaim the power that Woody took from him. And so Johnny Blaze, once he turns into Ghost Rider and he's able to fight back, he finds out that Woody's been horrifically experimented on and mutated into sort of tree-human hybrid. And it was a very unsettling visual. And, even, the Ghost Rider persona takes pity on Woody. And Woody, begs Ghost Rider to help him to, one, get revenge on Nathan, and two, to put him out of his misery. And he's able to use his abilities, to find resources he's able to find, say, oil beneath the world of Nathan. And he uses his power that's left over to him to make the oil, start erupting into this world. And he begs Ghost Rider to ignite it. And so Ghost Rider, he reluctantly does so because he doesn't want to kill Woody, but he also knows that there's no way to change him back. And so, he ignites the fire. And Nathan's father also turns against his son finally because, he sees that, there's no redeeming his son. His son's always going to be a monster. And while he may have been, protective and sympathetic to him initially because of, his tragic story, which he was there for, he realizes that, Nathan's just, too far gone. And so he, in some way, helps Ghost Rider to take his own son out. And once the world comes crashing down, the power that was going towards keeping the father alive just sort of dissipates. And so Johnny Blaze is able to leave the ruins of the world, but in a rather haunting visual, as he's leaving, you see the sort of desiccated husk of his father, buried in the ground, where the world once was. And so, that was actually, I thought, it was a very different type of story for the Ghost Rider series, but I thought that Roger McKenzie, made it original enough to where it was a good note for him to go out on as far as, his run on the series. And also I liked how, while, he was good at establishing some of the more supernatural aspects of the Ghost Rider's character, he also established that the evil doesn't necessarily have to be demonic in nature to be terrifying in its own way. And, that's what the character of Nathan was. He was a non-supernatural foe who was more, say, a mutant. And that's where, say, like the science fiction element came into play. And so I thought that Roger McKenzie did a pretty good job with that. And so once Roger McKenzie left the series, issue 35 was a fill-in issue written and illustrated by comic great Jim Starlin. And Jim Starlin, for those of you who don't know, is a really good writer and artist who, amongst other things, did a very well received run on the original Captain Marvel series, and I would say that if you wanted to read, say, like a standalone work of his, I would suggest The Death of Captain Marvel, because even if you hadn't read anything related to the character of Captain Marvel, I really think that The Death of Marvel actually did a really good job of showing a character passing on and basically saying farewell to their lives. And it's a very effective story. The fact that Jim Starlin came in just to do a fill-in story on Ghost Rider was rather interesting. But it turns out that this fill-in story is arguably one of the best stories from this time period in the Ghost Rider series, because what ends up happening is that it takes place initially in the present, and it's not throwing aside, say, prior plot developments. It's still acknowledging the fact that Ghost Rider is taking on a more, I guess you could say, central focus in terms of the identity of Johnny Blaze. But Johnny Blaze, as he's driving along, he starts to remember a time from when he still had a stronger measure of control over the Ghost Rider persona, and back when he thought that he just turned into Ghost Rider while still maintaining his identity, and he remembers a time in which he seemingly had a motorcycle race with Death, or at the very least someone who claimed he was Death, and it was this biker clad individual who very much looked like Death, skull, skeletal figure and what have you, just in a biker outfit. But he's forces Johnny Blaze to race him, as Ghost Rider, and he gives him 3 chances to beat him. And the thing is, each time there's a certain soul at stake. And if Death gets to this person first, then he takes their soul. And so Johnny Blaze is having to, literally outrace Death to save this, whoever the person is. But once they get to the 3rd race, that's when Death tells him that Johnny Blaze himself is the prize. And so Johnny Blaze just narrowly manages to cheat Death by resorting to, say, some underhanded tactics. And he remembers Death's words that basically anything goes. And so by doing that, he sort of tapped into, his natural motorcyclist capabilities, wherein he cheats Death on a daily basis, but he actually manages to focus that in such a way to where Death is cheated of his prize. And I mean, as simplistic as the story sounds on paper, it was a very entertaining story, and it harkened back to some of the stories like, say, from EC horror comics or what have you, both in terms of visuals as well as, say, the tone. But nonetheless, it's a moment that, even though it's a fill-in story, you get the idea that it really stuck with Johnny Blaze, throughout his whole life. Because on one hand, he's probably thinking, okay, was this actually Death, or was it just some supernatural, maniac pretending to be Death? And so it implies that it was actually Death himself, or itself, actually trying to get Johnny Blaze's soul. But it was an entertaining story, and for a fill-in story, it was pretty damn good. So once that passes, issues 36 through 50 were written by Michael Fleisher, and he was, if I remember correctly, the longest running writer on the series, and he not only built on some of the lore that was established in the stories prior to his run, but he also manages to add his own touch to this series, and I think that he definitely helped to give the series some form of creative stability, because he was tapping into, say, what writers like Roger McKenzie and Jim Shooter had done, and basically what worked with their runs on the series, and he was building on that, but he was also bringing his own voice to the series, and I think that for a time, at least, he really helped to elevate the series to where, it was already starting to become good when Jim Shooter took over, and then when Roger McKenzie was handling the series. But then when Michael Fleisher took over, the amount of time he worked on the series, at the very least that's collected in this volume, he did a really good job of, say, making the Ghost Rider character into, say, someone who was more than a niche character. Like, he was more, say, he became, the book, I think, really became something that mainstream audiences could appreciate, as well as besides horror audiences. But I think like one of my favorite storylines that Michael Fleisher wrote was in issues 43 through 44, wherein a wizard who is alternately called the Red Mage as well as Aziza, he actually separates Johnny Blaze and Ghost Rider to where they're two separate individuals. And this is the first time within the Ghost Rider comic that that's actually happened. And granted, it turns out to be a scheme for Aziza to get Ghost Rider to be housed within his own body, because it turns out that he has this orb that he stole like a long time ago that gave him his powers, and he used it to rule from the shadows in various ways. But the orb is actually dying out, and so he finds himself in a position to where he has the knowledge to separate Johnny Blaze from Ghost Rider, and he's counting on Johnny Blaze to try and get Ghost Rider back into him, so to speak, or to reattach himself to him, because he knows that Ghost Rider, unchecked by him, will cause untold amount of havoc. And so Aziza comes very close to doing so, because Ghost Rider nearly kills Johnny Blaze on more than one occasion while causing said untold amounts of havoc. But Johnny Blaze is able to shatter the globe once he finds Aziza's hideout. And once that happens, Aziza just turns into a desiccated husk, and Johnny Blaze is able to look through the tomes of mystic lore that Aziza has, and he's able to find the spell to basically restore Ghost Rider to him. And it's not something he wants to do, but at the same time he knows that if he doesn't, then Ghost Rider will basically just turn Earth into hell. And so he reluctantly casts a spell that he finds, and the two of them are remerged together. But this was literally the first time that the two of them had been physically separated from one another, and you see just how terrifying Ghost Rider can be. And also, like, there were a couple other stories that Michael Fleisher did a good job on that I think stood out. Like, I think it was, give me a sec here, sorry. Yeah, issue 47 actually has, it's a one-shot story, but nonetheless, it has Johnny Blaze at kind of his lowest psychologically, because prior to issue 47, he had tried to have a competition with another stunt cyclist named Flag Fargo, and Flag Fargo initially is introduced as somewhat of as an antagonist, but it turns out he actually has a certain amount of respect for Johnny Blaze. But at the same time, he resents how Johnny Blaze has, in his own words, been going around the country feeling sorry for himself. Now, granted, he doesn't know about him turning into Ghost Rider, but all he knows is that he was at one time a champion stunt cyclist, but then he just kind of gave up the game. And so he's going on and on about how he's going to beat Johnny's record, and he's very close to doing it. And so Johnny Blaze, in a bout of self-pity, decides that, only I can be the champion. And so he takes Flag Fargo up on his challenge, and he actually comes very close to... initially Flag Fargo's just wiping the floor with him and showing just how to practice Johnny Blaze is, whereas Flag Fargo had been hungry for the prize, so to speak. Like, he was hungry to be a champion, and so Johnny Blaze comes very close to resorting to using the Ghost Rider abilities or the persona to turn the competition in his favor, but he ultimately finds that he can't do it. I mean, he could, but as a man, he knows that if he did that, he'd win, but he also knows that he would be cheating, and so cheating death is one thing, and also there was a moment where he thought that Flag Fargo was involved with some criminals, because it seemed like anytime there was the two of them had a competition, wherever there was whatever town they were at, there'd be a bank robbery of some sort. And so what was happening was these criminals were using the distraction of the Flag Fargo and Johnny Blaze competition to rob the banks, because people were going to see the competition, and the banks were left unattended. And so Johnny Blaze initially thought that Flag Fargo was kind of the ringleader in all this, and so he turns into Ghost Rider, to get Flag Fargo to confess. But Flag Fargo's like, and he's freaked out, but he's like, I don't know what you're talking about. And so at that point, he has sort of a, my God, what have I done, type of reaction, because he realizes that he came this close to searing Flag Fargo with his hellfire, which anytime he does that to someone, it's like their part of their soul is sapped, literally, and sent to hell. And, that's one of the reasons why criminals are in utter fear of him. And so he realizes while Flag Fargo is a bit of an ass, he's not a criminal. And so, he was this close to frying an innocent. And so when the time comes for their final competition, he, finds himself in a spot where, he's actually doing pretty good against Flag Fargo, but he knows that, it's sort of like neck and neck. They're both equal in terms of, in this particular competition. Even though score-wise Flag Fargo's ahead of the game, Johnny Blaze is able to keep up in different ways, but rather than just wiping the floor with the competition by turning into Ghost Rider, he decides to try and do it on his own, and he loses. But he accepts that he lost, and it's something that really shakes him up, because he realizes that he came, very close to damning an innocent soul to hell in some ways, but he also realizes that, the curse of Ghost Rider has robbed him of the life he once had. He already knew this, but the fact that he was defeated in his own game, it really shook him up. And so in issue 47, which, sorry, I was initially going to talk about that, but had to throw in the Flag Fargo backstory. Issue 47, I think Michael Fleisher wrote one of the stronger stories, because it deals with Johnny Blaze trying to cope with the Ghost Rider curse by resorting to alcohol. And and he's so desperate to keep the demon quote unquote bottled in that he tries to just go on a bender, on more than one bender, as a matter of fact, and it ends up getting him in all sorts of trouble. And some of the people that he comes across in this particular story, they're trying to tell him that, hey, I mean, you might have your problems, but getting drunk is not the solution to it. And for the time that it was written, it was actually pretty realistic depiction of someone relying on alcohol as a coping mechanism. And for a one and done story, it was pretty effective. And Johnny Blaze comes to realize that the Ghost Rider is something that for the time being he's stuck with, and he can't compound one form of damnation with another. Namely, he can't saddle himself, with being an addict while he himself is still saddled with a literal demon in him. And so that was a pretty effective story. But then the other, I think, highlight for Michael Fleisher, in my opinion, was the last two issues that are collected in this volume, issues 49 and 50, wherein Johnny Blaze and Ghost Rider, or I should say Johnny Blaze as Ghost Rider, ends up going back in time through Native American enchantments into I guess I forgot what the time period was exactly, but basically it was the time of cowboys and Indians, and he meets someone who is arguably a predecessor of him, a man named Carter Slade, who was the original Ghost Rider, but for legal reasons they had to change his name to the Night Rider, I believe. And so in this actual story, he's just called the Night Rider. And then later on, in other books, he became, I think, the Phantom Rider. But when Carter Slade's stories were initially put out as comic books, they were in like a Western series of comic books, I believe. The book was literally called Ghost Rider, but I guess it was just for legal reasons they changed him to the Night Rider. But Carter Slade, though, he was a pretty cool character. I liked him, because in some way his story is touched by the supernatural, but he himself is not a supernatural character. In fact, what had happened was he had been robbed and left for dead, and he was a school teacher who had been robbed and left for dead, out in the desert, or in the wilderness, and his life was saved by the Comanche, and the medicine man was praying to his gods to help this man, and so I guess the gods answered, because they told him, they showed him where this meteor had fallen, and he said that the stranger that you're helping will come to use what's in the meteor to help his fellow man, or something along those lines. And so there was this phosphorescent essence that was in the meteor, and basically if you put it on you, you start to glow. And so the medicine man got this outfit together and doused it in the phosphorescent stuff that the meteor was made up of. And so once Carter Slade came to, the medicine man helped him to readjust and reconfigure the outfit where he was able to wear it, and he initially used it to go after the ones who left him for dead, but then he started to be sort of a guardian of the West, and he fought outlaws and rogue Indians and what have you. And so even though he himself was not supernatural, he was just an ordinary human who became skilled in the art of gunplay and fighting. But because his outfit glowed, people thought he was supernatural. So when Johnny Blaze is thrown back in time, and the two of them meet, there's a really neat moment where when Johnny Blaze turns into Ghost Rider, the Ghost Rider, who at this point is clearly depicted as being a demonic separate individual from Blaze, he finds a strange sense of kinship with Carter Slade, and so he basically puts aside his anger and his bloodlust to actually help Carter Slade. And I thought that was a pretty cool story where you see, the two Ghost Riders coming together. I mean, yes, I know he was called Knight Rider in this story, but this was the first time that two Ghost Riders had teamed up. And, of course, Johnny Blaze ends up going back into his own time once the story is over. But I also liked how there was some attempt at throwing in some Comanche folklore, because there was also a sort of spectral character by the name of the Manitou, who is this sort of a ghost-like Comanche warrior who had his own spectral steed, who was trying to guard the ancestral burial grounds of the Comanche. And he initially thought that Johnny Blaze was with certain individuals who were trying to basically desecrate the Comanche burial grounds and for their own, as a part of their own schemes. And so, I mean, I'm not sure, say in terms of if it's accurate in terms of real Comanche folklore, but I felt like that the creative team did a good job of, say, bringing something fresh and new to the story, in terms of, giving a look into, say, the spiritual side of things from another culture, and how Johnny Blaze, saddled with a creature from hell, has to contend with it, because the Manitou is actually one of the few people, or I guess you could say few individuals, who's able to hurt him in combat. Whereas most of the time, anyone tries to take a shot at Ghost Rider or stab him or something like that, there's almost no effect. Whereas the Manitou is one of the few individuals who notably hurt Ghost Rider on multiple occasions when they fought. And so it's after their confrontation that Johnny Blaze and Ghost Rider in turn are propelled back in time, and that's when he teams up with Carter Slade in the past. But anyway, though, I thought that in terms of final stories in this volume, it was a good thing. It was a good way to end things on. And Michael Fleisher would go on to write several more issues after the ones collected in this volume. But I really think that overall, the stories here were much more concise, and they were overall much better than the stories in Volume 1. And also appreciate how the horror aspect of things felt a lot more convincing, what with the Ghost Rider being established as its own separate identity from Johnny Blaze, and how evil he was. I mean, granted, because Johnny Blaze was a part of him, he was sort of confined into, say, taking out, his bloodlust on those who were evil. But at the same time, just because he was confining his attentions to, say, those who were evil, didn't mean that they were spared from horrific fate. And if they weren't outright killed, then they were put in a position where they wished they had been killed, simply because of what he ended up doing to their souls. And so, yeah, I just, in multiple ways, I really think that, Volume 2 is a significant step up from Volume 1, and it showed where the Ghost Rider series began to, not only become more competent in terms of the type of stories that are being told, but it also got to a point where the series became good. And so, just like anything else, any other collections of multiple stories here, there are a couple of duds. Like there are a couple of stories that feel like something out of left field. But these are mostly one and done stories, and they honestly don't detract from the overall good that this volume has. Now the funny thing is the one and done stories. Like one of them, I think it was issue 27. It was the last issue that Jim Shooter wrote. As much good as he did for the series, the last issue he worked on, it felt very random. It felt like something that was, say, more, it was more along the lines of the random stories that were kind of thrown together in Volume 1, in the sense that, yes, there was a non-supernatural foe, but called the Manticore, that Johnny Blaze went up against with the assistance of Hawkeye from the Avengers, as well as a Western character called the Two-Gun Kid, who was time displaced. And Hawkeye and him had become friends, and they were and he was trying to help the Two-Gun Kid get acclimated to modern time. But somehow or another, the two of them ended up crossing paths with Johnny Blaze, and they end up going up against this sort of scientifically enhanced person who's been sort of turned into a cyborg, called the Manticore. And it wasn't necessarily a bad story, but in comparison to the stories that came before that, it just felt very random. And if there had been maybe if say for instance there had been like another issue that had come after this one that Jim Shooter had worked on, I think the storyline could have been stretched out to two parts, where maybe Johnny Blaze, he developed a friendship with Hawkeye and the Two-Gun Kid, and then whenever the Manticore came along, they could have maybe had more tension once they see just how demonic the Ghost Rider is, because it's all, as it turns out, everything happens in just one story. And so right away Hawkeye and the Two-Gun Kid are creeped out by the Ghost Rider when they see him in action, despite the fact that he's the one who saved their lives from the Manticore. And I just felt like it was sort of a, you guys are being dicks, type of thing. But whereas if there'd been another issue that maybe had the three of them develop a friendship of some sorts, I think that could have been played for a lot more drama. And plus, the Manticore's involvement. If I remember correctly, there's some dialogue that hints at the fact that the Manticore was in some way involved with a fight with the Avengers at some point. So there's a reason it feels like it was pulled from another story, outside of Ghost Riders, because it was. And I just felt kind of confused as to say, why, they decided to, put someone else's story into a Ghost Rider story and kind of sideline Ghost Rider until, say, it's more like Hawkeye and Two-Gun Kid's story, and Ghost Rider's guest starring in his own book, from at least in this one particular issue. But I was just kind of like, it just felt, very confusing for me. And like I said, I really think it would have been better if they had, split it into two stories. And there was another story that, and it was actually one that Michael Fleisher wrote. He unfortunately was not without his duds, but there was a one and done story wherein Johnny Blaze comes across a mad scientist and his daughter, and it turns out that they had this guy had this anti-nuclear agenda because he had worked at a nuclear power plant, and somehow or another, the radiation he worked with, it killed his wife, and his son, or no, it didn't kill his son, but it sort of mutated him to the point where he was barely human, and so the scientist ended up euthanizing the kid. And so it's the scientist and his daughter, they've been sort of cut off from society for a bit, while the scientist has been working on this suit of armor that's nuclear powered, and he's going to use it to destroy the reactor, but he ends up running afoul of some gangsters who want him to use the suit's capabilities to rob banks. And it's one of those stories that I feel like it started off well, and when you find out the scientist's motivation, I mean, yes, it's very a tragic motivation, especially when you find out the fact that he euthanized his own child. But then once the gangsters get involved, they look very cartoonish, and the artwork's actually pretty good. It's just that for some whatever reason they decided to make the gangsters look like old school mobsters from the 30s, and the ringleaders looks like Al Capone. And so then when you see the scientist in his suit of armor working with these guys, you're like, this just looks ridiculous. And also the story, it just felt like something that was from the Silver Age, because it just that the scientist's motivation, while it's relatable, he ends up, once he has the suit of armor on, he becomes your stereotypical mad scientist supervillain. And thankfully, he's only in this one story, and he's dead. But I just felt like that this story, I mean, it obviously had a anti-nuclear message, or at least it was wanting to maybe be a parable about the dangers of nuclear technology. But at the same time, though, I think that if they had just focused on that, like maybe a one-off story where Johnny Blaze just spends time with this family and hears their story or something like that, and maybe have him reflecting on how he's, I mean, while yes, he has his own demons literally that he has to contend with, some are worse than others or something like that. I mean, that might have been a better story, but instead they turn it into like a Silver Age mad scientist gone amok story, and it's a really stupid story. So I mean, yeah, I mean this volume is not without its share of duds, but for the most part, though, the stories in here are legitimately good, and Johnny Blaze develops as a character to where he becomes a lot more relatable, and the reader tends to sympathize with him. Whereas in Volume 1, it was very difficult to do so because he felt like more of a caricature than an actual character. Whereas here, he actually becomes a character that, you read. It's funny. It's like night and day. You read Volume 1, and you're like, how the hell did this series go on for as long as it did? Because the series actually went for 81 issues, a very good run. But you read Volume 1, and the stories, for the most part, are terrible. I mean, they look good. I mean, really good artwork, but the writing was just all over the place. And so while there might have been some classic, Ghost Rider moments in that volume, there really weren't any good stories. Whereas here, in Volume 2, this is where you actually get good Ghost Rider stories. And it's not just, 50-50. It's more like, 9 times out of 10, the stories in this volume are actually good. And so you read Volume 2 and you're like, okay, now I can see why the series became, in some circles, as much of a classic, as it was regarded as. And so you definitely see where the series could go once the creative teams, brought their stuff to the table, at least as far as once they got out of the shadow of what came before, the stories that were collected in Volume 1, the creative teams that put the stories together that are collected in this volume, you could tell that they were really striving to escape, the prior story's shadow, but also to elevate the series to where it was actually, good. And for a time, it was. So I'm going to go ahead and give, Volume 2 of Essential Ghost Rider 4 out of 5 stars. This was a good collection. And one of the other cool things is that issue 50, since it was an anniversary issue, the original issue had some, pinup sheets, like some, posters almost, and basically commemorating, some of Ghost Rider's classic fights. Like you have a picture of him and the son of Satan teaming up against, the demons of hell. You have him and Ghost Rider. You have Ghost Rider and Hulk fighting each other. You have another picture of him and the Phantom Eagle in their sort of aerial combat, which is from Volume 1. And then, of course, you had the picture of him and the Phantom Rider. And so basically, it was I thought that was, it was pretty cool to have as a special feature in issue 50. Excuse me. But they actually included those pictures in the reprint of issue 50 as well. So I thought that was pretty cool. So that way, the reader already knew it was a special issue because issue 50 was double-sized in terms of the amount of pages it had. And so it was already a bigger, story than, the original, than your usual standalone issue. But they also went out, the people who put this volume together actually went out of their way, to include, the bonus features that issue 50 had. And so I really think that they did an excellent job with this. Also, I'm sorry, I forgot to mention, but issue 28, Roger McKenzie's first issue as writer, he brings back the villain, the Orb, who I talked about in my review of Volume 1. And the Orb was another motorcycle stunt rider who had, and if I remember correctly, he had actually, he was a rival of Crash Simpson, Johnny Blaze's foster father. And he had tried to, have Crash Simpson's, work sabotaged, but somehow or another that ended up backfiring and his face ended up being disfigured. And so, since he couldn't, go after Crash Simpson, he ended up going after Johnny Blaze. And so, he was actually introduced in an issue of Marvel Team Up, I believe. Because it was him and Spider-Man who went up against. It was Johnny Blaze and Spider-Man who went up against the Orb for the first time, and the Orb actually had this helmet that it looked like just one big eyeball that shot laser beams, and also was able to put out these sort of hallucinogenic effects like holograms and what have you. But unfortunately, the Orb's very first, story, which was in that issue of Marvel Team Up, was not introduced. Let me phrase that. It was not put into Volume 1. So when the Orb showed up in Volume 1, his presence felt very random, and his references to his and Johnny Blaze's prior confrontation was very confusing, because that issue of Marvel Team Up was not collected. And since the Orb went on to become somewhat of a classic Ghost Rider villain, you would think that they would have done that. But anyway, so he shows back up in issue 28, and he becomes a much more potent threat. And you really in one issue, I think, Roger McKenzie did a good job of, building on the established backstory that the Orb had, but also, making the Orb even more potent of a threat, because, now he's got a new ability, and that's to hypnotize people. And one of the things he does by way of torturing Johnny Blaze is he goes out of his way to find Roxanne Simpson, Johnny Blaze's girlfriend, and makes her literally forget who she is, and in turn who Johnny Blaze is. And so for a time, that's the last you see of Roxanne Simpson in the issue of Ghost Rider. Is, she's in the arms of another person and she doesn't remember who she is, and she doesn't know who Johnny Blaze is or anything like that. And so Johnny Blaze, because of story, he's in a position where he's forced to go on the road and what have you. And so I did like how the Orb, even though he was only in one issue in this volume, he was established as someone who actually had a vendetta against Johnny Blaze, and how he was much more devious this time around. And so sorry, I meant to mention that earlier, but I just kind of forgot about it, and so here I am now. But okay, so the one downside to the actual collection, I mean, not necessarily, I know I mentioned already that there was the occasional dud here and there, but there are some behind the scenes bits of info about some of the characters that show up here. And I think, it's all cool and everything. For example, like they have, like they have this little bit on Dr. Druid here. Doctor Strange, and of course, Ghost Rider. And on one hand, I felt like this was some really cool supplemental material, because you have like their stories and their abilities and what have you, all right there, just to read in brief. But the downside, though, is that when it comes to Ghost Rider, they actually talk about how Johnny Blaze's story ended, in the Ghost Rider series. And if you'll recall, I said that the series ran for 81 issues, and so we're talking like stories that were beyond this volume. And unfortunately, they talk about the final storyline in the Ghost Rider series, detailing Johnny Blaze's fate. And so for those who have not read the stories beyond this volume, the fate of Johnny Blaze is already spoiled. And so I thought that, while I did appreciate the supplemental material that was thrown in to this particular volume, I did think that they could have maybe cut back on some of the info that they revealed about the character of Johnny Blaze. I already knew what happened because if you recall my review of Volume 1, I talked about how I'd initially read reprints from the original series, namely the last few issues. And so I already knew what happened having read those. But for those who hadn't had any experience in reading the original Ghost Rider series, I just think that it'd be kind of a letdown to find out what happened by way of reading this brief supplemental material, as opposed to say being able to have read reprints of the original series. And so just a word of warning, there was that little bit of a spoiler there. But other than that, though, I was really glad that those supplemental materials were thrown in. And overall, Volume 2 was a significant step up from Volume 1, to where the stories collected here were overall good. And they did a much better job of giving credit to the creative teams as well. And so, and also, once again, much like Volume 1, the artwork was very well done. You had, even one-shot artists like Gil Kane. Fantastic artist. He co-created the character of Hal Jordan. He, for DC Comics, he only worked for one issue on the series, but it looks fantastic. You had Don Heck, who did issues 22 through 25, and then you had Don Perlin, who came in and did the majority of the artwork. He did the artwork for 26 through 34, 36 through 42, and then 45 through 50. A very consistent old school artist, and I liked how all the artists here did a good job of it's like it's old school style artwork, but at the same time, since this was pushing 1980, the artwork tended to be more streamlined as well, and so it was a good mixture of old school and then new school. But you also had Tom Sutton, who along with Don Perlin did some of the artwork on issue 28. And then, of course, you had Jim Starlin, who not only wrote, but he also illustrated issue 35, the one where he races death. And as I mentioned, that Jim Starlin fill-in issue is arguably one of the most fondly remembered issues from the Ghost Rider series. And then you had the great Carmine Infantino doing some guest artwork for issues 43 through 44, which, if you recall, were the ones I mentioned wherein Ghost Rider and Johnny Blaze are separated for the first time. And the foe in that particular storyline was the Crimson Mage, Aziza, and they did a really good job of making the wizard look creepy and like something from a cross between like fantasy and horror at the same time. And so you had to once again, much like Volume 1, you had a stable of excellent old school artists who managed to combine horror and the mundane. But the difference is, whereas Volume 1 looked good but read lousy, Volume 2 looks good and reads good as well. So definitely check out Volume 2. And like I said, 4 out of 5 stars. So you like what you see here, please feel free to like and subscribe, and drop a line if you want, got any questions or comments. And y'all have a good night. Thank you. Bye.